It's time for a quick rundown of experimental designs. Let's go. Now, there are a variety of ways of assessing relationships between data that you may be familiar with. For example, correlations tell us that two variables are related. For example, there might be a correlation between cigarette smoking and stress. But the question is, does stress cause smoking, or does smoking cause stress? Or maybe there's some third variable that causes both, such as low socioeconomic status, which is associated with both smoking and stress. Correlations can show relationships, but they don't show causation. Experiments, however, do show causal relationships. There are many kinds of experimental designs, but they all have some common elements. And today I want to talk about the dependent and independent variables. So the dependent variable is the thing that you're interested in. It's the thing you might measure, right? So if we're interested in smoking behavior, right? Maybe we want to help people stop smoking, then that's going to be the thing that we measure. We might measure the number of cigarettes smoked over some period of time, let's say over the course of a week. Okay, so that's what we're measuring. That's the thing that we care about. That's the thing we want to change. The independent variable is the thing that you manipulate. This is going to be the thing that you're going to take and see if it has an effect on the dependent variable. So for example, maybe I want to pay this person's bills for the month and then see if that reduces their stress, financial stress, right? Which should result in, hopefully, less smoking. When it comes to independent variables, there can be more than one independent variable in an experiment. Sometimes independent variables are called factors. You usually have one or more groups or levels in each factor. And the independent variable is the thing that you think is going to influence the dependent variable. Experiments usually can take the form of the following phrase: the effect of blank, the independent variable, on blank, the dependent variable. So I could do an experiment that I was just describing. It would be the effect of stress reduction on smoking behavior, right? Independent variable on dependent variable. Why do they call it the dependent and independent variable? Well, it's because the value you get in your dependent variable, the thing that you measure, depends on which group they were in the independent variable. Let's take a simple example. Let's say we're going to compare two groups of individuals. One that gets violin lessons and one that gets no violin lessons. And then we're going to measure their mathematical ability. Which of those was the independent variable and what's the dependent variable? Take a second and see if you can figure it out. Okay, in this case, the independent variable was violin lessons. I either put them in violin lessons or I didn't, right? So I'm manipulating that. That is an independent variable or one factor with two levels: violin lessons and no violin lessons. My dependent variable is the thing that I'm measuring, which in this case is mathematical ability. Let's look at a second example. What if I wanted to look at whether social media causes anxiety? All right, well, I'm going to be measuring anxiety, and I'm going to ask people to use Facebook either 0, 1, or 2 hours per day for 1 week. So I'm going to ask them to do that 0, 1, or 2 hours per day for 1 week, and then I'm going to measure their anxiety level. Okay, what's the independent variable? What's the dependent variable? In this case, the independent variable is Facebook use, because that's the thing I'm manipulating. I'm randomly assigning participants to one of those groups. 0 hours, that's kind of a control. 1 hour, so that would be a lighter dose of social media, and 2 hours, a high dose of social media. And then I'm going to measure how that affects their anxiety. One more example. I'm going to have people drink coffee, either 0 cups or 2 cups. I'm also going to have them sleep either 2 hours or 8 hours during the night. So I'm going to have some people who don't drink coffee and sleep 2 hours, some who don't drink coffee and sleep 8 hours, some who drink 2 cups of coffee and sleep 2 hours, and some who drink 2 cups of coffee and sleep 8 hours. So 4 groups total. Then I'm going to look at whether that impacts their driving performance. And I'm going to measure that by saying, how long does it take them to tap the brakes when an obstacle pops up in front of them in a driving simulator? So what was the independent variable and what was the dependent variable? Let's start with the dependent variable, which was, you got it. It's the thing that you measure, which in this case is driving performance, measured in terms of how long it takes them to brake. That's my operational definition of driving performance. And my independent variable was a little tricky because actually there were 2 factors in my independent variables. So I had one factor, which was coffee, which was 0 or 2 cups, so 2 levels. And I had another independent variable, which was sleep, 2 or 8 hours. So I had 2 independent variables, each with 2 levels, and I had 1 dependent variable. Okay, quick confusion alert. Sometimes people, when they look at an experiment and they see 2 groups, an experimental group and a control group, they start trying to say, well, one of these groups is probably the dependent variable and one of these groups is the independent variable. That's not the road you want to go down. The groups, if you're grouping something, then that's probably both 2 levels of an independent variable. The dependent variable is always the thing that you measure. You say, but I'm measuring the groups. No, you're assigning people to groups. You're measuring a behavior. So think of it as your driving performance depends, it's the dependent variable, on how much sleep you got and how much coffee you drank. Another pet peeve, just while we're talking about pet peeves, is that some people tend to say, when they're talking about the outcome of an experiment, that there was a correlation between driving performance and, let's say, amount of coffee consumed. Since this is an experimental design, what you really mean is a relationship, a significant relationship. In other words, you mean that, let's say, drinking coffee significantly increased driving performance. So you don't want to use the word correlate when you're not talking about a correlation. I encourage you to practice identifying dependent and independent variables in experiments and coming up with your own examples. This is important for understanding how different types of statistical tests work and determining what kind of statistical test you need to run. Notice that there are some things that I didn't include in the examples that you might be tempted to use, such as sex, or military veterans versus civilians, or maybe cat lovers versus dog lovers. What do those things have in common? The thing that all of those groups had in common was that they were all intact groups, groups that existed before they came into the experiment, meaning they weren't randomly assigned. I didn't flip a coin and decide, okay, this group is going to be veterans and this group is going to be civilians. They came into the experiment already with that in the background. That means that this cannot be a true experiment because there might be other variables that would lead someone to prefer cats or join the military. Since we can't control for these variables, we can't be sure that it was our independent variable that caused the difference in the dependent variable if we find one. Now, there might be cases in which you have no choice but to study intact groups because it would be unethical to do a controlled experiment. However, we call these pseudo-experiments because they're not true experiments. Experimental designs are the way we find causal relationships, and they're the backbone of scientific research. I hope this video has helped you to see the differences between correlational and experimental designs and what an independent variable and dependent variable are and how they're used. For more videos on the basics of scientific research in psychology and beyond, including basic statistics, please like, subscribe, and check out other videos on this channel. Until next time, keep thinking.